Well, hi, for Mr. Nick. So, what I want to talk about is this theory of the ages of man and just present some brief, concise evidence for the theory of it. And what the theory of the stages or the ages of man basically is that human evolution or progression of human developments mimics that or is similar to that of a human individual, of a human being. That we've gone through different stages of humanity, just as an individual goes through different stages of physiological and mental and emotional and social development. And that there is a history that we could look at, and there are some evidence to say it. But it's not that the evidence is totally conclusive or anything. So it is only a theory, but there's a reasonable enough amount of evidence to support it, although there's perhaps counter evidence that could say it's perhaps not progressive in that sense. But I'll demonstrate and give a brief account of the evidence at least, and then there's obviously a lot of counter evidence as well. But I'll discuss that just very briefly. Well, if we look at an individual, you know that it's obvious there's lots of stages to our life, and we know that from going through it and experience, from witnessing other people, if we haven't yet experienced it. There's obviously the birth, the conception of a person, and then the birth. And actually, before that, there's, of course, the development of the fetus and the different stages of the fetal development, in fact, from the earlier simple cellular structure transforming into the embryonic stages, and from the embryonic stages developing through to the more advanced, developing a more recognizable human as a fetal baby, and then the birth. Then, even as a young child, there are lots of different stages that we recognize. You know, those of early babyhood or infancy, as it's often called, a toddler, age 2 or 3, that has very different abilities to a 1-year-old because they accelerate in their evolution, in their speed at that rate. They're learning the difference between the different year groups in childhood is much more significant than in adulthood because there's an advanced, accelerated, a quicker development of those stages. So you see lots of different stages throughout childhood, not just the initial birth and the fetal development, but actually, the young baby, the toddler, the infant, and then, as they say, a young child, a middle-aged child, is very different as well. The abilities of a child at 4 or 5 is very different to 7 or 8. For example, one that is much more literate, is a higher amount of vocabulary and a greater grammatical abilities, and is much more socially coherent. And that advances into early adolescence, of course. That is another stage, separate but connected to childhood. If we look back over humanity's history or the evidence of the history, and I would say that there is evidence of humanity having evolved or developed through these different stages of its development, that humanity itself, if we go far enough back, was much more reliant on dancing and song and painting and sculptures as a method of communications. That is to say that artwork, if you look archaeologically, predates that of written texts that we have evidence for. So the earliest known writings can be traced back 4,000, maybe 5,000 years. There may well have been writing then, but we don't have any real absolute records that we can say. It's possible that that decomposed and that the records gradually over time disappeared. So absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence for absence. But certainly there's an evidence and a presence of lots of artwork, not just cave drawings, but all sorts of old sculptures that are found that have an artistic purpose to them. And we know that early primitive cultures were very much part of a dancing culture, that song and dance, a lot of their earlier writings, in fact, were very poetic, were lyrical, and were as much seemed to be musically based. So the early records of man are very much based on artwork, on pictures, on lots of drawings, not just on caves, but they're found in a whole variety of different records that you can find in archaeological digs that people have found various different pictures, symbols. And if we look at the early alphabet and the runes and the ancient symbols, they were very much pictographic rather than abstract. A little bit like the Chinese or Japanese script could be. Sometimes there's a meaning in the actual letter itself rather than an abstract thing that it stands for something else. It stands for something that it represents itself. In other words, it's more direct in its representation. So we find a lot of evidence, not just in ancient hieroglyphics, in ancient Celtic runes, and all over the world, in different signs and symbols and drawings that are used and that were recorded on bone, on canvas, on rock, that were stenciled onto all sorts of things. Sort of like early age graffiti, in a way, is how I see it, really. People drawing animals, some people drawing stick people. These are very simplistic, early drawings, of course, that you'd expect a child to do. They haven't got the rudimentary complex anatomy of animals, for example, but they draw mammoths, they draw different animals that are recorded. There's ancient pictures of giraffes, for example, and a whole variety of other animals that, whilst don't have a very good scientific anatomy, they're clearly represented as those animals. And they are much more ancient than any of the recorded writings that have abstract writings with abstract ideas that are found much later than that. So I wonder if that is because there's a lack of those written records and the lack of that evidence, or whether they just simply never existed, because in the early stage people communicated more by symbols, by drawings, by pictures, and perhaps also through dance and singing more, and through oral talk as well, rather than writing abstract things down in records and libraries that came later in an adolescent culture that was able to make vast amounts of records, to store vast amounts more information on science, on agriculture, and therefore to grow and to learn much more, that primitive earlier cultures perhaps were not able to do. They weren't able to build complex megalithic structures or vast cities that we began to do more in the adolescent phase or the adolescent age of humanity. A turbulent time, as adolescence perhaps is, with lots of strife and lots of different factions and gangs and lots of sectarian groups. And perhaps the world had fragmented at that point and broken up into these various more independent groups, but that still had relationships. And if you look at the wider relationship to Mother Earth, actually, that's what I want to really come on to, actually. That very much in the earlier primitive stages of humanity, we were much more dependent on nature as a mother. And many of the early religions actually had a mother goddess or Mother Earth, and there's lots of records and pictures of that, especially. And there's even written records and stories and parables and fables and myths and legends of the Great Mother. There's lots of so nature was very much seen as a motherly figure rather than as a partner to be wedded to, as it became, as working with nature rather than working under nature or being dependent upon nature for our very existence and our basic needs of food, of medicine, textiles, of shelter, and all those essential things. That we were very much under nature and under the elements, and that it was perhaps a dangerous, wild, Jurassic age, where there were great roaming woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, all those sort of creatures that have long gone extinct. Well, it was a very dangerous world out there, actually, for humanity, where we were very much under Mother Nature and having to live very much dependent upon her and not being able to, as we did later, landscape the earth and to dramatically change the earth itself by working with the earth rather than being under the earth. So I think the whole conception of our relation to Mother Nature did transform over the years. That in its earliest and more primitive cultures, that we all saw nature simply as a mother figure, as a great mother, as a provider, as a protector, but equally also as something to be feared and something to be protected from, that was also a dangerous mother sometimes if we didn't respect it or understand it or live under nature's rules. We're much more dependent on Mother Nature, but also much more fearful of nature at that time in the early primitive child stages of humanity. But in the adolescent later stages, as things have progressed, we're much more less fearful of nature. We've gone out, travelled. People had migrated and travelled much more around the world, had gone, like adolescents are, adventurous. They've gone on vision quests and sought out new lands and discovered new islands and boated and walked, travelled long distance and gone on great long epic rambles. And tribes had migrated to all different parts of the world by that point and had developed all the different gangs, that all had different allegiances and groups that shifted and changed. And that caused its own friction and turbulence and had its own good and bad about it, I suppose, as it is a struggle at that point to find a social cohesion. But I think in the adolescent stages of humanity, we're very much we're embroiled more in a closer, more intimate struggle against Mother Nature as well. But it was a struggle with Mother Nature in many ways, where we were much more landscaping, much more intimately and directly involved with nature. And in some ways, we conquered fears of Mother Nature by going out, by discovering new foreign virgin lands that had never been set foot on before, wild lands that had to be tamed, that had to be learned, discovered, understood, and that took lots of trials and experiments and lots of mistakes, but lots of progress was happening then. And so very much there are the different stages. And we know that an adolescent takes a very long time to actually go through, just like childhood is a very long, laborious struggle. It takes 12 years, in fact, to go through, just as the fetal development is a long 9 months. But the adolescent struggle is another 12 years because the actual brain is still neurologically developing all the way up to 24 years of age. So we mustn't think that the adolescent stage was a small gap between the long, drawn-out adult age of man and the childhood age. But it itself, the adolescent age, was a great, long, vast chapter, full of a long story, full of many, many, many chapters, in fact, just as childhood and adult stage of man is and has been too. So the adolescent stage of man, we were intimately more connected and more romantically connected, of course, with nature, and that had its good and bad, where we served Mother Nature in many ways, and we were able to be, in agricultural terms, progressive. We developed great land yields, planted forests, but we also cut down forests as well, and so we increasingly had a more dramatic effect upon nature itself, really. So the relationship was more vigorous and more dramatic in its effects, both good and bad. We helped heal many lands and people were responsible through agriculture of planting vast areas of land, of trees, of plants, and introducing different species of animals. So it wasn't just that people migrated, they brought animals and plants and seeds and ideas with them too. And there was a greater movement of ideas, of plants, of animals, and a turbulence that must have been as well, really. And there must have been a lot of good and bad in that whole experimental, often driven by passions and not by caution and rationality, because we hadn't entered into that age of rationality and we hadn't accumulated just enough knowledge to really know. And it remained the experimental stage for a long time, with lots of good and bad coming out of it, probably. Where we may have destroyed lots of things within nature, but also learned great things of how to support and use nature for the good of ourselves, societies, each other, and how to work with animals similarly as well. It was the age where animal husbandry was born, where people learned to train, to live, to domesticate animals, and to use them for good and to use them for bad as well. And so we had a much more intimate, bound-up connection with both nature and her animals. And that grew, of course, through the adolescent phases, springing into the summer of adulthood and the adult stage of man that we still are in, but we are in a much later stage, of course, because, again, like the childhood stage, the adolescent stage, the adult age of man is a long, drawn-out thing, full of many, many chapters, that can be progressive and regressive. It doesn't mean that, things can get better and get worse sometimes. They can get better and get worse. Things can progress in many areas and regress in some areas. And so I think that we've got to look at the different ages as having different abilities that change. Not that it's necessarily a worse age to be at, but that the abilities that you have at different ages change. The knowledge and experience that you've had, the knowledge that accumulates and is stored up, both good and bad, of course. Many people would say that we're in an older age, but how old, perhaps, is a question. There's old and there's very old and extremely old, isn't there? And they're not, the ages of elderly are just as numerous as the ages of childhood, in fact. So there are many different stages, many different ages to old age. In fact, we are living in a very old world. People say the ancient world was thousands of years ago, but this is the ancient world now, of course. And then it was a young world, perhaps, a long time ago. And the world has been getting older and aging because it's been labouring under intense sun. And the sun, of course, will have depleted gradually in its energy. And so it won't be the hot tropical world that it once was all those many thousands of years ago, however long. Whether we're talking many thousands or tens of thousands, you don't know when you go back beyond a certain point because there's a poverty, a lack of evidence, because a lot of it would have decomposed. Or just there would just be very little fragment left from the very earliest of stages, perhaps. So we don't really know that much way beyond that. But are we living in a very elderly age or old age of man? Well, there's a lot of reason to think perhaps the problems can accumulate, even though the solutions accumulate too. The amount of knowledge that we learn, accumulates over thousands of years. Even when we lose it, we rediscover it sometimes, or rediscover it in a new way, or put old things together in new ways. So elderly people do have an increased capacity of knowledge and accumulate lots of vocabulary, new words, new complex ways of learning this new syntax, and accumulation of new experiences, memories, knowledge of the world, but both good and bad, of course. That doesn't mean that we're only accumulating good memories or good knowledge. And so that's a test in a way that there were more testing and trying things that are sad and awful and hard, but there were more joyful, happy things as well. There is more good knowledge that's wise and interesting and useful and dependable and mutually beneficial, but there's also more harmful knowledge as well in life. There's more degrading things, but there's also more inspiring and use and great things. So it's a double-edged sword, really, isn't it? Knowledge, it's good and bad. So it comes with more responsibility in that sense. But elderly life also comes with its hardships as well. That can mean that you have less abilities as well, even though you may have more knowledge and have accumulated more vocabulary and more memories of the world, more experiences. But actually, you can through wear and tear, through using the body so much, through older age, through weathering and all those things, your abilities can become lessened. Things can become harder. And maybe that is the experience of humanity too, where our resources are becoming increasingly limited, where we've got to be more careful. Well, we don't have the abilities that perhaps we once did. We can't go out and deforest areas and turn it into farmland, where our resources are stretched now and limited now, and we have to now be more conscious and responsible and considerate because we have much less abilities than we once did. Where hundreds of years ago we may have had great pristine jungles and various parts of the world, unexplored land and all these sorts of things. There is no unexplored land in that sense, or very limited, or less of it now. And there's less of the earlier original primal jungles and earlier, and even the secondary forests are limited as well. So we do have to be careful with limited resources and limited abilities. And the challenges of being older and being elderly. But also involves a preoccupation with death, of course, as well, and thinking about the afterlife and spiritual matters, and thinking about looking back over our life as well, looking at our current life more, but looking at the bigger picture more and how our life now connects to earlier ages, I suppose, is a part of that. And looking ahead also, looking at what is death, what is a spiritual life, who are we, and asking those deeper fundamental questions as well, as hard as they are and as wrapped in mysteries as they are sometimes. It's going out into, and I would say it's not necessarily having a preoccupation with death, but actually discussing it and wanting to be more honest about it and be more accurate. And I think that's something that's understandable if you're much elderly. And I think as an elderly, older world, it's understandable that people do think more about the end of the world. And it is something that is obviously evident in countless end of the world films, books, TV dramas, discussions. It's saturated, isn't it? It's something that we've all obsessed about for decades, really. But I think that's quite natural that we would think about it. And I think it depends how you think about it, in what way. It does make sense to think about life and death, really, and to try and look at it honestly, and to study what it is, and to, you know, yes, to look at it with all the knowledge we've accumulated, but also to be aware of the limitations of our knowledge, and to question ourselves what that we believe, why do we believe it, how do we believe it, and under what is the evidence to say it. I guess we want to sort of face death honestly, and we don't want to sort of have beliefs about life or death that aren't born of our own experience and our own, but with a vast amount of experience, with an old world, with an old person. It's harder then, isn't it? When you're looking back over not 15,000 days, but 40,000 days, 50,000 days, isn't it hard then to look at the bigger picture, to remember the most important things, and to look back at memories that are so long ago? It seemed like it was another age, childhood. Even adolescence seems so long ago, like a dream world, like a distant place, like a distant planet almost, that it's hard to know the language of, that it takes a long time to remember, to study, to find other people to discuss it with as well, that it is that much harder then to actually to search through a vast compendium of libraries, and to search through what's relevant and what's going to be useful, and what's actually helping me and what's helping others. So I think that's a challenge when we're looking at issues connected to and look at the end and also the beginnings as well, that we look at it as relevantly as we can and sincerely, but also trying to look at it sensitively as well, because we've got to be careful and with other people's emotions as well as our own, actually, because it will store up and bring up sad memories and painful memories, as well as bringing up happy and reassuring memories as well. So, it's an emotional quest as much as as much as it is a mental and ideological one. So we're not just looking through memories trying to sort of find something to make ourselves laugh or to comfort ourselves. It is also looking at things to assess our own beliefs. Are they true? Are they supported by evidence? Is that what really happened? Did I remember it right? Do other people really think rightly about these things? Why do they? Or do they, do my beliefs accord with others or other books and films? And under what basis can I judge that? Only through my own experiences. But if we're not aware of our own experiences, then it's hard to sort of measure that. But it's very hard to sort of know, really, because experiences can be so many and change so much under such different circumstances, really. So it's very important to try and reconnect to our earlier ages, to find out the things that we learnt, the good and bad things, really, I suppose. And just because we might be at a very old humanity, and I believe that because of the evidence, but I'm not saying it's an absolute theory. I might be wrong on that. Perhaps we're in a midlife stage or something, and I'm having a crisis, and I'm completely mad or something. But maybe it is an old life, and an old world, and an old humanity, and we've got old problems and old solutions, perhaps. But somehow, I think that there's many different stages of that as well. The end is never really the end. There's lots of different stages to the end, isn't there, really? Just as there's no the beginning, there's lots of different stages to beginnings as well, isn't there? There's a beginning of a relationship when you first meet someone, isn't there? On first sight. There's the first kiss, isn't there? The first dance. There's the first argument. There's the first first time living together, first time working together, isn't there? First, all sorts of things. So, and just as with endings, really, there are many. There's the beginning of the end, the middle of the end, beginning of the end of the end, the middle of the end of the end, and then the beginning of the end of the end. You could go on and divide up into however many tiny factions you want to. But there isn't one end. There's lots of different partitions of endings, really. The end of adulthood is just the beginning of elderly life, really, isn't it? Just as the end of childhood was the beginning of adolescence, in a way. but just at 12 you end something, and at 15 and at 18 we're always ending and beginning things. But some endings are much more dramatic in their transformations, of course. Like the transformation of being born. The fetus to the baby is a dramatic thing. Like puberty, going from 12 to 13 or something, or through 12 to 15 or so. That's a very dramatic transformation, isn't it? With lots of physiological changes as well as emotional, mental changes. And just as the later adult has later changes as well that happen, that are more significant transformations than the gradual transformations that happen anyway. So I guess that's the. I think there's a lot more evidence that I could present actually in terms of the history of the ages of man. But I think that that to me is a sort of some of the more important parts of it. But I think that there's probably a lot more, if you search for it, you could find to support that. That then, and I think there's a reason to sort of knowing that, and that it's important to sort of try and work out where you are in life somehow, or where you are. And I'm still not sure really if it's sort of really just the beginning of the end, if I'm honest. It does feel like that somehow. But it could well be the middle of the end. But I don't know really. And it's quite hard being a middle-aged man, so I don't really have the experience of that. So I don't really know. But we're certainly not living in a childish age of man anymore, or adolescence. That was long dead, thousands of years ago, well, hundreds. Adult stage of man began, a long, long time ago, and arguably ended some time ago in a post-industrial society. Where, of course, elderly people don't have to work so much or not able to work so much, in fact, because of the accumulating illnesses and injuries that are sustained through the years of working. And so, maybe mankind is retiring. Maybe we are giving over to technology to do the work for us, in the industrial age. Maybe we are taking a backseat increasingly, and we are handing over to computers, AI and technology to do it more for us. And, we are all working much less. We are much more dependent on computers. Self-service checkouts are replacing staff at supermarkets everywhere. And eventually factories will close down and robots will do the job for them, and people can go on to care for other people or to do other jobs, to work, caring for animals, caring for the land, caring for each other. And so, gradually we've seen a lot of jobs being phased out and being taken over by computers and by technology. It started in farms where the ox was retired, and hardly any oxes now and farmers work in farms anymore. It's mostly just machinery and technology. A few people can run a giant farm, thousands of acres now. And what would have taken thousands of people now is just done by a small handful. So we are potentially gradually retiring from the demanding work that used to be done. But it's a gradual retirement, I suppose, rather than just sort of giving over everything to technology straight away. So whether we are doing that in a good way or not sometimes, I'm not sure really. I think there's a lot of good in giving over more things and depending on technology more. But I think perhaps we sometimes over-depend on it, especially on newer technologies we're not always sure about. But it's, again, we're always in an experimental age, and we know we've got to retire, but we've got to keep working as much as we can as well, according to abilities. So I think it's probably a good thing to depend on technology more, and I think there's a good logical reason why we all have done over hundreds of years more. But I think perhaps it's not time for humans to retire just yet, and there's still a lot of work still to do, really, with technology, with Mother Nature, with each other, and with the animals. So, yeah, well, that's the last bit of evidence. I put it in at the end because I forgot it earlier on. Must be because I'm getting older.